Were the Nazis socialists? The simple and easy answer is no. The longer answer is fuck no. And the extremely long answer is fuck no. Are you retarded? And what's wrong with schools these days? That aside, let's try and take this question as seriously as it can be taken. Socialism is a left-wing ideology. Fascism is a right-wing ideology. In order for the Nazis to have been socialists, a lot of things would have had to have been very different. But let's start on this with a different tack. Let's explain in which ways they were socialist, because they did have socialist policies, ones which they inherited. The Nazis had a national health service under them. This does not mean that national health services are evil. They do provide the best possible care for the least amount of money to the most amount of people. They inherited their national health service from the Weimar Republic, which came before them, and Germany was the first nation in the world, if I'm remembering correctly, to have a national health service, which was initially instituted under Bismarck, the architect of the German state. Removing popular social policies like nationalised healthcare is difficult even for totalitarian regimes that might want to. So you have to keep that in mind. It's not like they instituted a national health service for evil means. They inherited a national health service. It's worth quickly pointing out as an aside here that the Nazis didn't control weapons, at least not in a specific way. The Weimar Republic had constricted weapons, a relatively large amount, and in fact when the Nazis came in they loosened the restrictions on weapons, who could have what guns and how. So the whole gun control argument, invocation of Nazis, doesn't work either, but that's beside the point. Besides retaining the National Health Service, one way in which you could argue that the Nazis were socialist was in terms of their spending. They spent a huge amount of money to rebuild the German state and turn it into an industrial powerhouse. But this was largely military spending. And this is a model that was followed in other nations, which we probably wouldn't consider to be socialist. In the United States, the recovery from the Great Depression was kicked off by massive public investment. Other states followed suit. And the war, in a lot of ways, is what bailed out a lot of these countries. It forced them into mass amounts of public spending, which in essence was socialist public investment, and which dragged them all out of financial ruin. Of course, the war then knocked a lot of them right back again, but the point is there. So, having acknowledged that, is that sufficient to say that they were socialist? Well, no, these might be socialist policies, but that doesn't mean that the government enacting them is socialist. The USA, despite its best efforts since Reagan, still has certain socialist policies. Medicare, Medicaid, the massive investment in the military, which is kind of a welfare state by proxy for large parts of the states. But we wouldn't describe the United States with its relatively laissez-faire neoliberal capitalism. We wouldn't call that a socialist state. Even the people who get the definitions wrong wouldn't call it a socialist state. Equally, the United Kingdom, despite having socialist policies like the NHS, like the welfare system, it's taken a very long time for our right-wing, capitalist, conservative or new Labour governments to dismantle the NHS and to cause problems for that welfare state, because it's so unpopular to do so. And we wouldn't call the British government a socialist government either. This is probably the furthest right government we've had since Thatcher. Maybe even further right than Thatcher. She wouldn't have touched the NHS, and she wasn't keen on privatising the trains, if I remember right. So how do we identify things as things? How do we identify this as a Pepsi can? Well, as the exterior branding, I suppose, but the be-all and end-all of it is what's in there. What does it do? Does it fizz? Does it taste of cola? Is it sweet? You know, these are the things that define things. We look at an object or a person or an act, and we see which definitions it meets. So, do the Nazis meet the definition of socialism? I've gone on and on about what socialism actually is and isn't on this channel, but let's just quickly reiterate. Just to be confusing, socialism has two meanings. The first one is the one I normally strive against, which is the Marxist redefinition of the term socialism, and the second one is socialism as its own independent ideology. We actually for once need to tackle both here. So, under Marxism, and in official communist language, what socialism means is a social and economic system that's supposed to be a transitional stage between capitalism and full communism. The means of production are fully taken into social ownership manifested by the state, and the state persists as an administrative machine to uphold this new order of legality and this new system of rights. This is meant to enable the emergence of true common ownership and the eventual withering away and abolition of the state. So it's a transitional stage of state ownership where the state is considered to be the common weal, the stand-in for the common man. It's a way towards communism. It's also, incidentally, where communism tends to fail. Or rather, Marxism tends to fail because it never gets to communism. Now, regarding socialism as a much broader left-wing ideology and its key principles, we have a belief in equality, equal opportunity, egalitarianism, equal rights. All human beings are equally entitled to those rights and to a basic standard of living. The state as administrator, where the state is not seen as ceremonial or religious or anything like that. It's just a purely administrative device meant to act as a guarantor for the rights that derive from the belief in equality. So it tries to make sure that everyone has good access to food, medicine, education, recreation, and so on. And lastly, the elimination of systems of control, that is, socialism advocates that power should not be invested in too small a group of self-interested people, like, say, a dictator, or an elite monarchical class, or arch-capitalist oligarchs, those sorts of things. So how do the Nazis, how does fascism stand up to this litmus test of whether they meet socialism? Well, they're certainly not Marxist socialists. They were bitterly opposed to communists, fought them, killed them. The only time he had any real truck with communists was in invading Poland and sharing it with another despot. Totalitarianism respects no politics. It's a matter of personal power, so that's not that surprising that two tyrants could work together at least for a while until their egos began bashing together. So, definitely not Marxist socialism. He saw the gathering of power into his hands and into the hands of the party and a small cadre of followers, not as being a transition towards a communist state, but that was the ideal state, strong leadership, with as few cooks as possible stirring the broth, so to speak. So, that's kind of the opposite of the intention of Marxism, however that happens to have turned out in history, and I would consider Marxism to be a failed hypothesis at this point as well. Well, alright then, did the Nazis believe in equality? Well, does it even need saying that the answer to that is no? They looked down on Jews and other non-Aryan races as being inferior. They stratified their society on that basis. They abused their control of their health system to euthanize many feeble-minded and other disabled people. They did not regard homosexuals as being equal. They stratified their society along lines of party loyalty, along lines of race, along lines of gender. Women had very particular set roles. You were supposed to breed for the fatherland and all the rest of it. So, no, they did not believe in equality, and that is like the central plank of socialist ideology, this ideal of equality, which is why so many people today calling themselves socialists I don't think are. But in terms of the Nazis, rather than getting tangled up in today's redefinitions of terms, no, they were in no way egalitarian. Okay, so there's that. And then what about the state? Did they see the state in a purely administrative function? Did they see the state as separated from civic pride and religion and all these kind of events and everything? Did they see it as ceremonial? Well, they certainly did. They had all these marches, they had these big meetings and rallies and all the rest of it. They were really into their symbolism and their spiritual iconography and everything else, stealing it left and right, incorporating the occult and Catholicism and all kinds of old Germanic beliefs all together into this kind of nonsense amalgam, along with belief in the leader and all the rest of it. So they did not see a limited role for the state at all. They saw that the state embodied in the Führer, embodied in the leader, as being the be-all and end-all, and to extend its tendrils into every area of life. So in that sense, they can't be considered socialist at all. Minority control? Did the Nazis seek to eliminate sources of control by minorities? I suppose you could reach quite far and make an argument that they were fighting to prevent the Jews from controlling Germany. You could make that argument, but then they brought power into a relatively small cabal of pure Aryan leadership. So while you could make a racist and anti-Semitic argument that they were protecting Germany from a minority conspiracy that was controlling everything through the banks or whatever else, or Illuminati or aliens or whatever it is your paranoid conspiracy theory might be, Bavarian Illuminati maybe, who knows. While you could make that spurious and nonsensical argument, the fact is that even if they did, all they did was put another small cabal of people in charge. So no, they fail on all three tests. There's a few other bits and bobs we can point out that demonstrate that they were not socialist. Socialism tends to be internationalist, which is kind of cooperative, international coming together, rather than business-oriented international coming together, which is globalism. So socialism tends to be internationalist. The Nazis were nationalists. You could, I suppose, argue that they brought everything into the government, but what they actually operated was not socialised central planning and control, but rather cronyism. They brought in companies and friends and people and operated on a cronyist basis, and corporatism. So rather than the government necessarily taking over private enterprise, rather they brought private enterprise into government. That's corporatism. There's a whole bunch of other bits and pieces, but the three prongs that define socialism demonstrate more than adequately, in my opinion, that they were not in any way recognisably socialist. Despite what they were called, they may have called themselves National Socialists, but, well, is the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea democratic? No, it isn't. You can call a spade a spoon, but it's still a spade. Zang.